Thank you. Can everybody hear me okay with this microphone? Very good. All right, before we get too far gone in the camera, I'll get rolling. Let me pass out just a couple of flyers about the, Sherry, thanks, about our internet site, Southern Spaces, which is a digital journal, media journal that's free on the internet, and we cover the South in space and place. We have a number of Alabama pieces up on there that you can use in classes or you can just entertain yourself with. We have some pieces by Alabama poets such as Jake Adam York, who has written a series of poems on civil rights martyrs, and we've gone around with him to video those poems on location. Rodney Jones, who's probably among the most well-known of Alabama poets, who comes from Hartselle. We've been up there to do poems with Rodney and his memories of Alabama. And there are a number of, Wayne Flynn is up there on the website. I think people can hear me through the microphone. Yes, we're getting the thumbs up from Ed. I can also use this mic if need be, but I think
she said she wasn't hearing it upstairs.
Okay. I actually think that's working, but we'll go with both. What I'd like to do today is talk a bit about the Alabama Getaway book and answer questions and hear your comments about this particular project. Maybe one thing to say first, this is the first time I've been back here, and not in this auditorium, but I guess we were in the one adjoining this, when there used to be this wonderful event that Ed and his staff organized, these Alabama Studies Symposiums, and which were terrific 1 or 2 day events that brought a lot of people together who were interested in Alabama topics. And I guess the last time I was here was 2003, as I can recall, because I know Mill's book had not been out so long, and he gave a presentation, and I've thought again about what a remarkable day that was, that particular symposium. I was reminded of that coming here today, because Randall Williams was selling books at a bookstall out in the Rotunda, and Mills was giving this presentation on the kind of local aspects of civil rights history, and Bailey Thompson was still with us, and Bailey was talking about the history of constitutional reform in the state and what a long and kind of tragic episode that has been. That was going on as part of the symposium. And there's a group of people, as I recall, one of them was a German craftsman who were working on the restoration of the Civil Rights Monument outside on the Capitol grounds. And then on that very same day, as I remember it, there were several hundred people were marching up Dexter Avenue who were quite concerned with the voting rights of ex-felons in the state of Alabama. And there were the usual advocates for those causes. And I thought that was on one particular day, and I wrote a chapter that almost got to be a chapter, but I couldn't quite figure out how to pull it all together, in which I was talking about how on just this one day you had all of these forces in Alabama history, past and present and future, coming together in this space. So I hope one day the Alabama History Symposiums can return. Part of my mission, I've talked at a couple of places about the book since it's come out, in Auburn, which is where I was born, in Tuscaloosa, where I went to the University of Alabama. I've been to Virginia, to the Virginia Book Festival, Chapel Hill, Duke, and among the things that I'm discovering and have decided that are quite significant is the re-emergence of an interest in state history. So part of what I'd like to kind of push and present today, and this looks like a great audience for that, would be the significance and importance of state history and state history writing at a time when I know a lot of colleges and schools are emphasizing science and math and technology. It's my argument fundamentally that if our governmental leaders knew a little more history, they wouldn't continue to blunder us into tragedies of the past. And I continue to think that history is probably the most fundamental of the disciplines. So I'm going to make part of a pitch on history. My particular background is in American Studies, however, and this book, Alabama Getaway, is an American Studies project in the sense that it's an interdisciplinary effort that draws upon a lot of different kinds of sources, and so it's not a strict history book, or although I hope to be informed by historical approaches and methods. So maybe what I would begin with is a little talk about the title of the book, the subtitle, and exploring some of the themes that lead out from that. The notion of Alabama Getaway, as many of you may know, comes from a song by the Grateful Dead, which has a character in the song which the protagonist seems always to be trying to get rid of, to make it go away, this character. Not altogether successfully. And part of what I was struggling with is a kind of ambiguity about the idea of Alabama Getaway. I myself and a number of the people I write about have grown up in Alabama, left the state. Sometimes people come back. Sometimes they go away to stay. Sometimes they stay here and don't go away. And I'm trying to work around a number of ideas about what the effects of coming and going from Alabama are on people's political consciousness. So the notion of the subtitle, which is the political imaginary and the heart of Dixie, has to do with something which takes a minute or two to explain, but it's not a difficult notion that's used in a lot of political theory now, the idea of political imaginaries. And this is a way to get at what we might think of as reputation or impressions or how a place is perceived. And part of my work in this book is to look at how the state of Alabama is perceived outside the state as well as within the state by a lot of different groups and constituencies. So the notion of a political imaginary captures that concept pretty well. I draw a lot upon many different kinds of sources, everything from late night television, jokes and humor, which for a while at different periods, Alabama becomes, as you all know, the butt of jokes on late night television. We've seen this happen, particularly in the Bob James administration. I think that was one of the more painful episodes that some of us experienced, being out of the state and having to see different manifestations of FOB projected across the national media. But these things come and go. So representations in that way contribute to this notion of the political imaginary. I can draw upon speeches, newspaper stories, movies that have been made, jokes, different kinds of ways in which people talk about the state, advertisements. All of this is sort of fodder for people working in American Studies projects. So that's the idea of the political imaginary, how the state gets represented. It's not always how things are actually taking place on the ground, and oftentimes there can be a real lag between how a state is perceived and what's really going on. And I think a lot of that is true in Alabama because there's been, as you all know who have been here or come and gone, over the last decades there have been many transformations. Among the most outstanding, of course, the civil rights movement and all the effects of redistricting, voting rights, the campaigns for segregation, desegregation battles. All of those things have been a formative means of changing the state and the state's image, so that once upon a time, perhaps the state was looked on as a place more retrogressive than it actually has become or is now. Indeed, as you also all know, tourism is a major mainstay in the state, and a kind of tourism that has to do with civil rights sites as much as anything else. So there is a sense of the state of Alabama becoming well known as a kind of battleground state for civil rights, so that people make pilgrimages here from all over the world at this point. And there are bright spots and interesting developments across a number of lines. If you're in Birmingham, of course, there's the medical center and the research that goes on there. Huntsville has been a dynamic technological center. So the images that people have, even a figure like Jimmy Wales, who began the Wikipedia project, comes from Alabama. Not a lot of people would associate him with that. And so there's a lag, or tends to be a lag, between this notion of how the state is perceived and some of the changes that are actually going on in our midst. And so that's part of what I'm trying to sort out, work between. Among those ideas are the ways in which old habits of judgment and feeling, which is a personal ways in which identity gets formed, that old habits of judgment and feeling sometimes give way very slowly, or sometimes are very recalcitrant in their ability to change. So on the one hand, you've got these large images of the state of Alabama, the political imaginary, which I try to sum up in the more retrogressive form with this idea of the heart of Dixie. So we're standing kind of in the heart of Dixie, and I try to use that idea to see what the heart of Dixie has meant. If you go on to the State Archives website, there is a really interesting history of the use of this term, the heart of Dixie, when it began and how it originated, that I talk about some in the book. It was originally a tourist Chamber of Commerce notion, a kind of public relations tool when it emerged in the late 1940s and early 50s in this public way. So part of what I'm getting at is what is captured in this notion of heart of Dixie as a political imaginary. And on the other hand, ideas about habits of judgment and feeling, how children grow up learning what they learn about race relations, what they learn about gender identity, politics, political culture. Those things are learned as children and are oftentimes difficult, if not impossible, to transform. And there are ways in which a number of deep habits of judgment and feeling I talk about persist and hang on in the state, along with this notion of the political imaginary. One way to make sure I actually get through in the time I've given is to kind of go over the chapter titles and suggest what I'm trying to do in the book, and then maybe read a short little passage from the book. I have the book divided up into 3 parts, and the first part does deal with this notion of habits of judgment, and in that I try to rely a lot upon autobiographical material, memoirs, people's life stories about how they grew up in the state. Much of the book takes place between the last George Wallace administration, the 1970s, and comes up to the present. I actually have a few comments in paragraphs about Alabama politics and culture in the last year or so. But so it's a recent attempt to summarize the political culture of the state since the early to mid 1970s, with echoes back into the 19th century when necessary. So notions of habits of judgment are pretty important, the way in which kids grow up, the schooling, how you learn to make your judgments, how feelings get made, as well as the words and deeds of particular political figures. Again, George Wallace still looms as a dark and extended shadow across the state, and down to the current governor's rhetoric, you can hear echoes of phrases and ideas and formulations that actually began, if not with William Yancey, certainly were extended and began with George Wallace. So one of the figures I try to deal with is the long, sort of haunted legacy that we still have from the Wallace years, and how easy it is for particular governors or political figures to fall back upon phrases that George Wallace would use. Among these kind of deep connections is certainly this anti-government notion, deep-seated notions and hostility towards government in almost any form, certainly federal government, and how that kind of rhetoric is so second nature that it sometimes becomes a difficult task to say that government and government institutions actually do have useful and good purposes and need revenue sources to support them. So part of the argument that I trace is the lingering way in which people pick up the habits and phrases and speech patterns of folks like Wallace and carry them on long past their usefulness. Among the habits of judgment that I talk about are a lot of different kind of fundamentalisms having to do with formations of ideas about religion, about gender, race, sexuality, and these are deep habits which I use other people's writings, again, comments, interviews, television appearances, to try to explain and look at some of the deep-seated habits of judgment that get formed. One of these habits is the notion that I call the punitive habit, which has a lot to do with an orientation towards punishment and punitiveness that I think gets expressed in a lot of different ways, but certainly, in fact, I have a chapter devoted to the Alabama prison system, drawing upon as a kind of summary comment a quote that I run into again and again when I was reading about different prison systems, and I think the way in which I use the notion of the punitive habit or judgment and connect it to Alabama and connect it to the prison system speaks to this quote from a dissident who was a Yugoslav political dissident who spent a lot of time in prison, Joan Didion, who writes, "The way prisons are run and their inmates treated gives a faithful picture of a society, especially of the ideas and the methods of those who dominate that society." And I think there are many ways in which, if you're looking for ghosts that haunt the state, contemporary versions of what we would call ghosts would be people that we would rather not look at or rather not see. And I make the argument that the people who are in prison in the state, and the state has one of the largest percentages of people in prison and for longest terms, that if you want to find the way in which the state is behaving in punitive fashion towards African American people, towards working class, lower class, marginalized white populations, the prison system is the place you look for that. And the long history of overcrowding and mismanagement and malfeasance and abandonment of many thousands of people in the prison system is the most representative way in which I talk about the punitive habit. But the punitive habit permeates a lot of Alabama thought and consciousness, even down to the present. So there's a chapter on the prison system and its relation. There's also a section in the middle about what I call public figures of speech. And this begins with a reprise, again, of the contribution and the legacy of George Wallace, and how he left the state pretty much in the ditch and abandoned in its social obligations, but picks up on then a long series of the governors, lieutenant governors, some significant state legislators, the senators, generally the U.S. representatives for the large part. All of these people I have, since the 1970s, trying to look at the way in which the actual political culture and language, how was the state represented by these kinds of figures. And the phrase I came up for that group of people was oaths of office. And I think with few exceptions, in the large main stage of American life, when you see many Alabama politicians from the 1970s on into the end of the 20th century, that's how oftentimes Alabama's political people get to be seen, and the examples are endless. I read many newspapers across this time period and tried to choose examples that were not just odd, exceptional examples, but really emblematic examples. I could have found 10 more for each one of the ones I tried to choose, in which you have a political figure behaving badly in a very large public way that gets negative attention to the state. I conclude that section with kind of revisiting the Siegelman-Riley campaign in a chapter I called "The One Trick Pony and the Man on the Horse." And if you remember, the one trick in Siegelman's group of tactics was the lottery. That was the only thing he would ever say. I don't have a plan B. I don't have a fallback strategy. And then there is a sense of the emergence of a figure like Bob Riley, modeling himself on Ronald Reagan, obviously, the man on the horseback. And if you remember those ads, he always reminded me more of, some of you are not old enough to remember the television series of the Davy Crockett, Daniel Boone world, where Fess Parker was the figure, the man, sort of the frontiersman. And Bob Riley always reminded me of Fess Parker in the David Crockett series, and he seemed to kind of be emblematic of that attitude. And so I try to contrast and compare and suggest what went on in that political campaign and then what becomes of Bob Riley's aspirations, which, as we all know, he got to office and realized things were in much worse shape than he thought. And he did come up with this notion of the tax amendment. And I guess the last time I was in this building and we were talking about this, that was the issue. Was there any hope that Amendment 1 was going to pass? People were hopeful that some attention was finally going to be given to the revenue side of government, actually increasing revenues in ways that would actually not starve the state socially and certainly not starve the branches of government that really need to function well. So I try to deal with a lot of those kinds of questions and the outcome of that, and then the reversal that Riley made, which essentially sort of found himself almost converted and then lost the election and retreated back to a much more conservative, more predictable kinds of Republican politics. Part 3 of the book tries to deal more with what I see as kind of the insurgent positive qualities of change that have taken place. And to do that, I begin, of course, with the African American movement for voting rights, but post the actual civil rights movement, to look at ways in which those African Americans who were elected in different kinds of offices around the state, particularly in places like the Black Belt, which becomes this sort of formative political region, the way in which those figures work to get redistricting done, the way they try to do the most they can with the resources that they have in those communities. And obviously, whether you're talking about white or black politicians in Alabama, you've always got instances of corruption and people going off track and abandoning their constituency. So it's not a totally happy story of progress and change, but I guess my large argument is across this period of time, if we had listened more to the directions that were articulated by the African American politicians and leadership and rank and file in the state, some of the courses that our state government and indeed our national politics would have taken would have been much better. You could just take the one example perhaps of the Iraq War, in which the only state, our congressional member from Alabama, the African American representative in Congress, voted against that, and this ties into this longer notion I have about habits of judgment, the deep-seated quality of militarism within Alabama culture, particularly white culture, that you can trace back again to the 19th century and some of the ways in which both Native American populations and African Americans were dealt with during that time, but continues to be, if you look at the examples we have of Congress people coming out of the state of Alabama, current, whether they be the Republican representatives or current state senators, they are irresponsible in their ability to respond to the real needs of average Alabama people. They sent folks off to wars that we shouldn't have been involved in. They vote against efforts to have health care. They work on, if you think of our major, Senator Shelby is kind of in the pocket of the banks. These are major figures misrepresenting the ordinary interests of most Alabamians out of this long history of political kind of dominance and inequalities. The state remains, as you all know, the place where the lowest taxes are paid by people who could well afford to pay more than any other state in the country. So I have a long section on the emergence of black Alabamas, as I call it, and those people who spoke oftentimes, someone like John Lewis, who, of course, from Alabama, one of the most outspoken people against the Iraq War. So I try to use examples of people who are from Alabama who make statements to show that indeed there is a deep progressive lineage in the state. Oftentimes it has lied with African Americans, not altogether, but often, and to try to identify not just as an outsider, somebody from another part of the country, but to say if you listen within the state of Alabama, you can actually hear as sharp a critique of foreign policy as you can hear anywhere in the country. It just comes from sources we're not used to listening to. I have a chapter on a chapter called Baghdad is Birmingham, in which I take a long look at the emergence of Condoleezza Rice and how she essentially used or played up her connections back to Birmingham during the civil rights years, even though her family was distance from the on-the-ground movement, indeed looked askance at the grassroots kind of solidarity, community organizing approach to the civil rights movement, and her trajectory out of that world into this world of Republican war policy making and working for some very powerful figures, and then making a comparison, as she would do, between Baghdad and Birmingham, as these are movements of liberation that you could somehow compare in foreign policy. I have a final chapter which I call Invasions of Normalcy, which is the notion of normalcy comes from a quote from Dr. King when he was doing the Selma to Montgomery March, and he said, "No, we will not allow Alabama to return to normalcy." And I think the idea there is once a certain kind of consciousness emerges, the way in which you have to continually work and mobilize and teach young people to try to build upon that possibility in consciousness. It's something that still has to go on, and part of my push for the study of Alabama history would be to actually have classes and courses where I remember my fourth grade class was not a very substantial Alabama history class. I understand there's a lot more going on because Ed has talked about efforts to more widely teach and work with groups to teach Alabama history, not only in the fourth grade but in high school. But most of those courses used to be taught by football coaches. I can remember that well, and you never really learned a lot about this kind of history. And so part of my argument is, and part of the reason I wrote this particular book, although it is founded in certain deep theoretical and kind of political arguments, is that I tried to write it to be funny, and I think people who've reviewed it have found it to be funny, and also to be readable by ordinary people, to get in, and also the University of Georgia Press made this book possible as a paperback book right from the beginning. They set it up that way, and you can get them on Amazon, for what is a reasonable price, $20 or so. You can get this book. So we tried to put it out there so that people possibly could use it in schools and classes, or at least in public discussion, to try to teach some Alabama history in ways that wouldn't have to be dull and dry and tedious. Now, of course, Alabama does have one of the great prophetic historians in Wayne Flint, and Wayne's book on the 20th century in Alabama is a very important piece of work and was very valuable to me, as was discussions with Wayne. But what I've tried to do is sort of bring things up to the present and really focus upon lively images about how the state is perceived, what are these emblematic political battles going on, what are the effects on the next generation of Alabama children coming along. So in the context of doing that, and I will try to move toward reading a short little section and then open things up for questioning. One of the notions I came up with from reading a couple of memoirs was the idea of unbecoming, how one unbecomes your background. I used to remember at the family reunion, when you weren't behaving right at the table, they would say, "How unbecoming," but this is a little different kind of notion of unbecoming. I guess I should also say that the notion of Alabama Getaway is not that you single out or pick on a particular state. This was the state in which I spent most of my life, and certainly most of my time thinking about things has been about Alabama and its the universal implications of what goes on in this state. And in the Grateful Dead song, Alabama Getaway, there is that line about 49 states all had Alabama in their eyes, and then there's that Neil Young song about you've got the rest of the Union to help you along. So I'm not trying to pick on the state in that way. I would say that if you went to California or New Jersey or Arizona, all of these states have their own combination of ingredients that make them what they are. And I've tried to sort through with this notion of habits of judgment. What are these constellations of habits and ideas and attitudes and feelings that make Alabama, Alabama? So that's been my project. And it was helpful to read, for instance, Joan Didion has a wonderful book called Where I Was From. That's a memoir about her growing up in California, coming from this pretty well-to-do old Sacramento family, and talking about how she got her consciousness, how she got her ideological orientation. And here's a quote from Joan Didion that I found quite helpful. Her book, which is called Where I Was From, quote, represents an exploration into my own confusions about the place and the way in which I grew up, misapprehensions and misunderstandings, so much a part of who I became that I can still to this day confront them only obliquely. And I think among the things I discovered, working on the Alabama project, is indeed Alabama is a state where there still is not a lot of coming and going, external migration, not a lot of travel unless perhaps you're in the military to other countries. Immigration is changing some, but there's still a sense of you grow up with certain cultural habits, attitudes, ideas. These are very early formed, and it's very hard then to get a grasp of those things and how much they deeply affect your feelings about life, about attitudes and judgments. The other book that was important in this kind of construction did come from Alabama, was Diane McWhorter's book called Carry Me Home, which some of you know, which was basically about the 1963 events, the Birmingham bombing, and how she had to work out some relationship to her father, who in some way had a hand in all this, in some way was never quite clear how much he was connected to the Klan or not, and she tried to uncover this history between well-to-do Mountain Brook Birmingham and white working-class Birmingham and African-American Birmingham that led up to what was called the Year of Birmingham, 1963. So let me read a sentence or two from this reconstruction of Diane McWhorter's work. Diane McWhorter writes of a long personal transformation accompanying her quest for knowledge about her home city and about her father, suggestive of Didion's lifelong search for the meaning of California and her uneasy inheritance of location. I found, in other words, that there were writers who were going back, really trying to scrutinize how they grew up the way they did and questioning some of those fundamental notions of how they grew up. Both Didion and McWhorter sprang from families of privilege, gifted, articulate children headed for conventional promise. Both eventually broke from their expected trajectories to question where they were from and what history and location had to do with the making and undoing of themselves. And this is a quote I found quite important. Indeed, writes Diane McWhorter, I was very much a part of my place. Sometimes for a city as well as a person, growing up means becoming what one will unbecome. So McWhorter, as you know, went off to New York. It took her a long time to kind of come to grips with her Birmingham history, perhaps 20 years to really uncover and write what became Carry Me Home, which really does, as much as any book does, it makes really vivid this white supremacist mayhem that was Birmingham in the early mid-1960s, as well as the African-American insurgency that overcame that oppressive time. And there's one other person who I've mentioned to a couple of folks since I've been here, Jake Adam York, one of the poets that we've worked with on the Southern Spaces Project, who grew up in blue-collar, Gadsden, Alabama, where his father worked as a steel worker and his mother taught history in the public school system. Jake York studied architecture and English at Auburn, and then he went off to get a master's degree at Cornell, and he began to write poems. He's now at the University of Colorado in Denver. And he published a couple of books. He's actually published 3 now, largely dealing with this kind of personal truth and reconciliation effort that he's gone on that delve into Alabama history. If you want a way to accessibly get at Alabama history through poetry, which is readable and lively and interesting, Jake York's books, one's called Murder Ballads, one's called A Murmuration of Starlings. I think the latest one's called Persons of Interest or something like that. These are books that come out of his deep Southern and Alabama experience. He comes from a family that had lived up in North Alabama, for generations. But he had to undergo this process, and you don't always have to do it by leaving. You can do it somehow by staying here, as Randall has shown us. But let me read this one little quote from Jake York's moment of leaving Alabama, leaving Gadsden to go off to Cornell to study, and then ultimately to come back and write about Alabama. Think of everything you hate. librarian's eyebrows, Baptist deacon's hair, a bookshelf of Bibles and nothing else. Walk through your room once again, checking under the bed, the desk, and all the dresser drawers. Don't think of how everything you own fits in this one little car, how your whole life could be erased if you wrecked in just the right place. Look straight ahead, adjust the rear view mirror. Feel it warm beneath your hand, its box of river and sun and steel and shadow. Ignore your heart rising to your throat, this terrible relapse. Think of everything you hate, everything, then pull the mirror down. So this is a moment I think that captures, to me, a lot of people's moments in this Alabama getaway experience. Again, you don't have to get away literally, but you somehow have to do it figuratively. Such is the dilemma of the Alabama getaway for the native son or daughter, whether staying or leaving or returning, how to get clear of the heart of Dixie. For many of us who come from Alabama, the political imaginary seems as natural as an old banjo song and as compelling as habits formed in childhood. So I guess I would offer up, as the new state motto, how unbecoming, which could be on our license plates instead of. Let me see how we're doing on time. This is probably, I'd love to hear what some of you have to say or questions. The book has only been out a couple of months, so I'm not sure anybody's had a chance to actually read it, but I'd love to hear if some of you have or have thoughts or questions about some of the topics that I've too briefly skirted over too fast. I think there are microphones to be. Yes.
Thank you. I haven't had a chance to read it. It's great. Thoroughly recommended.
Okay.
You mentioned, Allan, the failure of Judge Moore to light the kind of fire that many feared he would be able to light in Alabama. Is this on? Do you have any thoughts you could share on the prospects for the Tea Party movement finding a foothold in Alabama? Doesn't seem to have found a very visible presence here. Can you?
I think some of you all might do better at that than I, because you're here in the midst. It seems like there are many ways in which Tea Party was anticipated by a lot of things that have gone on in Alabama. I think if you go back and look at what it stood for originally, nobody uses that notion anymore, but it was taxed enough already. I think that was the original. TEA was taxed enough already. And I think this deep anti-government, anti-tax attitude is very pervasive. And you remember John Edgerton's book of a few years ago called The Americanization of Dixie, in which he said a lot of things that go on first in Dixie find their way out into the larger world. And I think in some sense that's the way some of the Tea Party has worked. There was already a deep built-in animosity towards taxation, toward government, that I still lay a lot of that at the doorstep of George Wallace, that just deep, and like government, it can only be oppressive. We have a talk radio show guy in Atlanta, Neil Bortz, who won't even call schools public schools. He calls them government schools. It's all to build up this animosity towards government. And it seems to me that we've been at the point for a long time where state agencies of government, even wonderful institutions like the Alabama Archives, all of these institutions have been squeezed, and there are many, I see, and I know some people who are very loyal, wonderful folks who've worked their whole lives in the state of Alabama bureaucracy, and they've done really wonderful work for people in the state, but there is this deep animosity out there that's fed by these politicians, partly because governors in some sense have very limited range of power, and so it tends to be a politics of resentment and the anti-tax, anti-government policy. It's a very male world, it's a very white world, and these are all things that Alabama was practicing long before the Tea Party came along. Is it Jim? Are you Jim? Yes, I remember Jim from folklore school. Yes.
Hey, I don't know exactly how to phrase this question, but obviously in your book, you talk to a lot of people like yourself who had left but continued to deal with Alabama in their work.
Mm-hmm.
And as someone who left and came back but continues to deal with I think it's an interesting phenomenon.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of people like you that I admire, or William Christenberry. Christenberry says he can't live in Alabama and do the work he does, or filmmaker Margaret Brown, or Albert Murray, who says everything he does starts with a Chinaberry tree in his front yard in Mobile. Can you reflect some about both yourself and the other people you talk to in, kind of the spiritual dimension of this Alabama-ness and why you can't leave it alone?
Yeah, that's a tough one, Joey. Joey's an example of somebody who really, dedicated your whole career to coming back and doing good work here, and people should be very pleased that you have been here for so long and done so well. It is a perversity that you have. I don't quite know how to explain it. That you come from some places, and Alabama seems to be one of those places. And Rodney Jones has a great quote. Let me find it because I'd read it. Rodney sums this up quite interestingly in here. Rodney's the poet from Hartselle, and he says, he now teaches in Carbondale, but writes about Alabama, can't get away from it. He has, what's that poem called, The Death of the Southern Accent, or some poem. He writes always about family reunions in North Alabama and caves, and he says, although he remains in a permanent psychological exile from my homeland, when I lived there as a kid, I thought I had some kind of political obligation to change things in a way that as an adult I saw couldn't be accomplished in my lifetime. And I think it's this first part, some kind of political obligation to change things. I don't know where that comes from, but I think some of us who did grow up in, that's part of the Baptist social gospel tradition that some of us really latched onto. And there is that our connection through a certain kind of social gospel that some of us experienced. And once it grabs you, it's really hard to let go of. I know a lot of people who go off to Atlanta. There actually used to be a course taught at Emory in the night school called How to Lose Your Southern Accent. And people would pay money and take this course, and so they could do business in Atlanta with all the Chicago people and the New York people who were coming through. And I've lost a lot of mine, unlike Joey. I've lost a lot of my accent, but I think there is for some of us, it's not true, but for some of us, for whatever reason, I think I was deeply moved and affected by the actual civil rights movement. I guess this is the other deep question. What is there going on now for young people, for teenagers who are coming along that transforms them in this way so that they unbecome? And I don't know if there is anything. For some of us, it was the civil rights movement and the example of all of these people in the streets, many of whom were using this rhetoric of social gospel, and it made us feel like we should get in there and be a part of this somehow too, and I was definitely transformed in that way. For some of us, it was also the anti-war movement of Vietnam, and that had a kind of prophetic dimension too. There were a number of Will Campbell, you can think of these Southern Baptist figures who were opposed to the war. So there was a dimension, a strain of this that I think some of us tapped into. And somehow we had to go away before we could come home, and others didn't have to, but were transformed in some way to a different sense. I don't know what's going on now. I go back to the University of Alabama. It seems largely to have gone back into the world of sorority, fraternity life, and football. If you look, you could compare the whole state archives with the buildings that they have down there on Fraternity Row and Denny Stadium, coming into the archives, and it's like two different worlds, as wonderful as this building is. The wealth and power and money that's connected to the football world dwarfs anything else almost going on in the state. So maybe is that a transformative spiritual experience?
I think the book does a tremendous job of cataloging our ailments, but I was left at the end wanting to know where you place your hope, and this maybe builds on your last response, but is it, having been afflicted with the consequences of Wallace's style and language, what does it take, and where does Alabama as a state try to find inroads to reversing that trend? Is it going to require a political leadership that comes from, I don't know where exactly, but can have the same kind of influence, or do you see it in grassroots organizations? Is it in religious communities? where do Alabamians today try to start to build a different type of community and sense of relationship?
Yeah, I think a lot of that's actually going on. Again, it's not part of what's perceived from the outside, but groups like Alabama Arise and groups that what's the A+, the group for education, the constitutional reform group. All of these groups are kind of grassroots alternatives to the failures of politics by normal means. And I think somebody would have to probably correct me on these numbers, but it's always been the notion that if you could get all of the African American electorate plus, how much would it be? 35% of the white vote or 40%, then you could have a statewide candidate elected. And I think that's what people should be working towards, building these kind of coalitions, interracial coalitions. Race still is a major factor in the state, whether people want to openly acknowledge that or not. It's reflected very much in the political voting and turnout. So if you could build these coalitions beginning on almost any issue, just find something that you're mad about, and organize or connect to somebody with, and that still to me seems the best hope for kind of building this democratic movement, that there are people here. You think of those folks like, again, Bailey Thompson, the folks who worked on the tax reform study, Ron Casey, I don't know if you remember him years ago. People have come and gone and given their lives to transforming the tax structure, the Constitution. Those are movements that I think still have a lot of promise if people will get aboard and not be so pessimistic about the possibilities. It's really a moment of opportunity. We've seen the great failures, political and economic failures. Out of those moments come genuine moments of transformation. You never know quite where they're going to begin, as people here in Montgomery should know as well as anyone.
Do we have another question? Anyone? Would you like to say a few words in conclusion?
Oh, just thank you all for being such a good audience. And I'm glad to be back here and see familiar people again, and hope that you will enjoy reading this book and maybe pass it along to others. It's only been out a couple months, as I said, and we're trying to get some public discussion going with it. But thanks.